All right. Yeah, thanks for having me, you guys. It's nice to give a talk to a group of beekeepers. This will be pretty much a science-focused talk. So I hope that it's interesting to you, maybe useful, and I'm happy to answer questions at the end, but it might be a bit different from some of the talks you're used to seeing. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my work on honeybee aggression. And I titled this talk, "A Drink from the Magic Well." This is a famous quote from Carl von Frisch that I'll come back to. But um, one of the themes of this work for me is that studying aggressive behavior, which may seem a little bit limited, thinking about all the cool stuff that honeybees do, can actually lead you in some pretty interesting directions, thinking about how colonies survive and thrive in different types of environments. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that journey. Um, sorry, I'm working on my slide advancement here. There. Uh, when I talk about aggression in honeybees, the real primary context for this behavior is in the context of nest defense. And you all are beekeepers, so you've experienced honeybee aggression firsthand. Um, uh, Honeybee defensive behavior is actually quite specialized and very specific in a lot of ways. So there are actually two different types of defensive specialists in the hive. We have the guard bee. These are the bees that monitor the colony entrance. You might see them smelling incoming foragers. That's what's pictured here, making sure that this forager is from the correct colony and not invading bee that might be trying to steal food, which we'll talk about in a second. So the guard bees are kind of the first line of defense. When they perceive a threat, like an intruding bee or maybe a larger predator threat, they are the ones that really coordinate the defensive response. They extrude their stingers. You might have seen this. If you disturb a colony or pull the lid off with little warning, you'll see a lot of bees sticking their stinger out. And they're emitting an alarm pheromone. That's that banana pheromone smell. It's the same thing you smell if you get stung. That pheromone coordinates a defensive response where dozens or hundreds or even thousands of individuals become angry and irritated and start to seek out threats in the environment. It's a really fascinating ability that the honeybees have. They actually have a collective defensive response. So they have to work together. A single bee is not sufficient to get rid of something like a large predator threat like a bear. And so, thinking among the animal kingdom, this is one of the ways that honeybees are really special. So they're social, but they can actually also perform these behaviors together. They don't just cooperate, they act collectively. So the guard bee coordinates that response. There's actually a second type of specialist bee associated with defense. These are called soldier bees. So there are studies that show that soldiers are actually a distinct group of older worker bees. They're forager-aged bees, but they specialize in flying out and attacking predator threats, usually larger threats, something like, a bear, maybe a beekeeper, something like that. So already you can kind of see there are these really special categories of bees. The defensive behavior is quite sophisticated inside the hive. And it's a really critical aspect of colony life, being able to defend the colony. Any species that lives together collectively and has a nest where they keep food or babies or anything has to defend that nest as a territory and a resource from all sorts of other things. So, honeybee colonies are filled with literally, hundreds of pounds in some cases, of really good honey, high calorie honey. There are also bees that can be a food resource for other predators. So this is a really high value commodity, the honeybee nest. And there are a lot of things that try to get in there and eat bees or food. So we have other honeybees. There are other arthropods that try to get into colonies as well. I've got some examples here. These are all different insects that I've found inside beehives at some point in the past. Some of them are just coming in and drinking some nectar. Others are killing and eating the bees themselves. We don't have anything as impressive really as the northern giant hornet, also known as the murder hornet. That's a honeybee specialist predator. There's the yellow-legged hornet in South Carolina and Georgia that also is a predator of honeybee colonies, but we don't have that here in Kentucky at this point. But so there are small predators, insect predators, and then there are the more familiar, larger things like bears and raccoons, and even beekeepers. So, you know, as a beekeeper, nest defense is kind of an annoying feature of honeybees, but it's really essential to their survival, and it is one thing that makes this species pretty effective at maintaining these high-value nests. So I told you about the behavioral specialization associated with nest defense, but I just wanted to also tell you that there is a lot of physiological and morphological specialization too, where you have this very elaborate sting apparatus. As you all know, honeybees lose their stinger when they sting. And this is not just a venom delivery mechanism. It's actually really sophisticated. These pictures here are showing you a close-up view of a worker stinger, and you can see these barbs. You can also see in this picture on the right what's actually in that sting complex that gets ripped out of the base of the abdomen. It's got a ton of muscles. It's got a lot of different glands that produce venom and other things. It even contains part of the nervous system. That's one of the things I think is most interesting, is that the sting complex continues to pump venom into the target even after it's removed from the bee. So it's almost like a little autonomous chunk of bee. So this is a high degree of specialization. It's clear that over time, this ability to sting and effectively defend the colony has made, you know, the honeybee really formidable, being able to defend its nest, but it's also clearly important for the colony survival. This little timeline here, I'm just showing you again where the defensive specialists fall. This is probably review for many of you, but adult worker bees, they're actually not sort of one single category of individuals. Instead, they specialize on different jobs. And one of the major factors that dictates the jobs they perform is their age. So when bees are very young adults, they tend to clean the cells, clean the hive. They act as nurses for quite a period of time. I don't have all of the jobs on here. This is just a kind of a select few. As the bees age, they transition to tasks at the entrance of the hive and then eventually outside of the hive. So the middle-aged bees are things like fanners that ventilate the hive, guard bees, which I talked about. The food storing bees, these are the ones that receive nectar from foragers and go put it away where it belongs. And then some of the oldest bees are the soldiers and ultimately forager bees as well. Okay, so nest defense is and aggression is really important for survival, but it's been surprising to me over time how much this focus on aggression has kind of opened new doors and really interesting research avenues. Here's that quote from Carl von Frisch: "The bee's life is like a magic well. The more you draw from it, the more it fills with water." So it's just the idea that it's kind of an endlessly fascinating organism, really, in terms of what it's capable of doing. And what I found over the last about 15 years that I've worked on aggression and nest defense is aggression is so much more than nest defense. I originally got interested in this behavior because of the social components. So I have this, you know, cartoon here. It's a little tongue-in-cheek, but the idea that, you know, your social environment shapes your behavior. That's true for honeybee aggression. We've shown that in a number of studies. Even larvae that grow up in a highly aggressive environment are more defensive and more aggressive as adults. So there are clearly ways that the social environment's playing a role in affecting aggression in honeybees as well as people. But we've also found evidence that the level of aggression can predict performance capability for individual bees. Aggression is a high energy behavior. It requires flight. It requires a lot of activity. The bees that are able to exhibit that high level of aggression are also good at other behaviors that require energy. So things like foraging. More aggressive colonies tend to have a higher rate of foraging. We've done a lot of work actually on how the energy balance associated with aggression impacts not just things like the muscle that are required for flight, but also processes in the brain. I won't get into detail with that, but there's some really interesting relationships there too. Some of our recent work has also focused on the links between aggression and disease response. And what we found is some evidence that more docile bees and more docile colonies, if you look at their immune system function, they actually resemble a sick bee. So we have some evidence that these low aggression colonies, even if they don't have a disease, they may be predisposed to reacting poorly if they get infected because their immune state is weakened for reasons we don't understand. It could be genetic, it could be related to other stressors. We've got a lot of work going on right now where we're looking at how immune system function affects things like cognition and behavior in honeybees. So aggression is just one area that ties into this. And then finally, I'll tell you a little bit about this area, but it turns out that colony aggression predicts floral resource availability in the environment. This is kind of a surprising relationship, but actually, if you know something about the level of aggression a colony is displaying, it could tell you something about the amount of food that's available to that colony. So I wanted to kind of start with that area because this is some of our interesting recent work. It links aggression to the floral landscape, but also to everyone's favorite behavior, which is honey robbing. So I'm going to tell you about that too. So the idea that aggression is tied to floral resource availability is actually not new. So colonies show increased defensiveness in contexts where they're threatened by robbers a lot. And honeybees tend to rob when resources are low. So I'll tell you a little bit more about honey robbing later, but the basic thing you need to know is honey robbing is the situation where honeybee colonies, instead of foraging on flowers, will actually attack other colonies and steal stored food, stored honey. And it's a really interesting behavior, but also very destructive. It can kill the victim hive. It's a source of parasite and disease transmission. So it's kind of a bit of a nasty behavior, but very interesting. So honey robbing and this tendency to perform this behavior is tied to seasonality. So I just wanted to give you some examples of the ways that the landscape and the bee community actually changes across the season. So, we kind of think about the summer as being this kind of uniform time when things are active. But if you look across the spring, summer, and fall, when honeybees are active, there's a lot that goes on in the environment over that period of time. So just as an example, this picture on the right, this is from some work we've done looking at how these blooming winter weeds on corn and soybean fields impact honeybee colony health. And what's interesting is that this is a cornfield. In March and April, you can see these blooming weeds. This landscape looks very different in the middle of the summer when there's corn on the field, and the landscape is quite distinct and very uniform. So this is just to give you a sense that the quality of the landscape changes over time. It's really important to remember if we're interested in ways to enhance that quality for bees. I also wanted to point this out. This is just a figure that shows you a lot of different bee species. So not honeybees, but all sorts of other stuff. Some of these things you're probably familiar with, like bombus. These are bumblebees. Xylocopa is a carpenter bee that you probably see around right now. So this is just showing you when these species are active across the spring, summer, and fall. And you can see just all the variation. Some of these species are active for a very short time period. let's say in April or May. Others are active at kind of a moderate level throughout the season. So both the bee community and the flower community are really constantly changing over time. And one of the things that I find really interesting, we know that the changes in the flower community over time should impact bees because that might, add or subtract the available flowers to bee species, including honeybees. But one thing that I find particularly interesting and kind of underappreciated is that the bees' foraging strategies themselves also change over the season. So these long-lived species, like something like the honeybee that's active for such a long period of time, they're not doing the same thing every day, for all of the months of the activity period. So just for example, this little figure here in the middle is showing you how colonies change throughout the season. So, in the winter, of course, they're kind of in a hibernation state. They're keeping the colony warm and eating all that honey that they stored up. This is just a picture of one of these warm colonies in the winter. Pretty high hive temperature has to be maintained. Very energetically expensive. It takes a lot of honey to burn to maintain that temperature. So we're now in this kind of spring period where colonies are reproducing. But, in the late winter, the queen starts laying eggs again, the colony starts to grow, and then the colony reproduces. Most colonies reproduce in the spring. The summer is kind of a stable period. There's some continued population growth. But then we reach this kind of critical point of the season, which is this kind of late summer, early fall period of time. This is a critical time period because, resources become more scarce at this time of year in a lot of places in the temperate US, but also because the colonies are really trying to make sure that they collect enough nectar to support themselves over the winter. So they hoard food throughout the year, but they tend to get more desperate at this time of year. They need 50 to 75 pounds of honey to survive the winter, depending on, where you are and how big the hive is and that sort of thing. And we do see that there are some major changes in how honeybees behave at this time of year in response to those food shortages. So the combination of food shortage and impending winter promotes this behavior called honey robbing. And where we are, and in a lot of temperate places, this is a late summer or fall phenomenon. And so one of the things that's interesting, again, related to nest defense behavior, is that colonies become more defensive as honey robbing progresses, as it becomes a more common behavior. So you can see the number of guards that are hanging out at the colony entrance and the number of fights these guards are having. Both of these increase in the sort of August, September, October, late summer, early fall timeframe. And this presumably reflects nearby colonies trying to get inside and steal food. The guard bees are reacting and trying to keep those bees out. So it's not surprising necessarily that a colony may become more defensive, may post more guards, for example, because they're getting attacked. They sort of, it would make sense that that would prime their defensive response. But we found something kind of interesting several years ago with respect to robbing. We actually found that nestmates that come back from a robbing trip are more likely to be attacked by their own guards compared to a typical nestmate that's coming home from foraging on a flower. So this was surprising. We expect intruders to make the colony more defensive, but the bees are presumably able to tell their nestmates from an intruder. And yet they're more likely to attack their nestmate if they've been robbing. We did a few different experiments around this problem. One of the things we did was try to see if it's a change in scent or something like that. You go inside a colony, you root around in the comb, you steal the food. The honeycomb is actually one of the big sources of odor differences across colonies. So it's possible that these robbers are just getting coated in a different scent, and that's causing the guards to attack. We didn't find that that was the case, at least in the experiments that we performed. And so it kind of led us thinking, or left us wondering, if there was some other cause of this increased defensiveness towards these returning foragers. One hypothesis that we assessed was whether returning robbers are actually more aggressive, that the forager itself is more aggressive. And that is actually provocative to the home guards, that they're responding to their behavior. And so we've done a little bit of work on this idea and found kind of some interesting results. So we have some data to suggest that robbers are more aggressive than flower foragers. So this is a forager bee. They're not a defensive specialist, but they show a high level of aggression. We actually used a gene expression analysis. We looked at the brains of these bees to assess this. We looked at gene activity for a few genes that we know predict differences in aggression from our previous work. And basically what we found is that if you compare a forager coming back from a flower to a robber, they actually show a gene expression pattern in their brain that looks a lot like a soldier. So even though these are foraging bees, they look like a defensive specialist in terms of their behavior. So that was actually really interesting and really surprising. It suggests that these robbing bees are distinct in some ways from other flower foragers. And we found some other evidence of that as well. We did some additional work to try to figure out the cause of this change in robber aggression. One idea we had was that eating honey may cause you to change your aggression level. The reason we thought that is that honey, as well as nectar, contain what are called phytochemicals. These are plant-derived chemicals that are neuroactive. Neuroactive just means they can have behavioral effects. And so other studies in a variety of species have shown that consuming some of these phytochemicals can change behavior. That's not been studied for aggression. So we were wondering if that's part of what's happening here. There are different phytochemicals that are high in nectar versus ones that are high in honey. These are right here on the bottom axis, the x-axis here. We're looking at all these different chemicals that we tested relative to just a sugar control treatment. And so we fed bees these different phytochemicals and measured their aggressive behavior, and we didn't find any evidence to support this hypothesis. So it doesn't seem to be that consuming honey is causing this effect on robbers. We do have some evidence, though, that it's actually fighting and interactions at the victim hive or the food resource that might be causing this change in behavior for robbers. So in this particular study, we trained foragers to collect food at a feeder. We marked them with individual number tags and then followed them home and looked at whether they were attacked by a guard when they tried to get inside the colony. And we found that as the number of bees at the feeder increased, so the number of interactions among individuals fighting to get to that feeder and consume food, as that increased, these foragers were more likely to provoke a guard when they got home. So that was kind of an interesting finding, suggesting that it's actually the physical interactions of the bees at the food resource that are causing that behavioral change. So more recently, we've expanded this work to consider some other really important communication signals inside the honeybee colony. One of the things that we found that was, I think, really cool is that these foragers foragers in general seem to become more conflict tolerant later in the season. So many of you are familiar with the waggle dance phenomenon. This is the dance language where foragers can come home and tell their nestmates location of food and recruit them to that food resource. So that's what's called a positive recruitment signal. It increases the activity at a food resource. Well, honeybees are actually also very naturally risk averse. So if they get attacked by something when they're eating at a food resource, they have another signal they perform when they go home. They can actually tell their nestmates not to go to a particular resource. That's a negative recruitment signal. So this negative signal is called the stop signal. It's compared to the waggle dance, a very simple, very quick behavior. And basically what you see is the returning forager will headbutt another bee and emit a particular frequency of a buzz. And I think I have this queued up here. Oh yeah, can you hear that? Were y'all able to hear that buzz at all?
No.
Oh, okay, so that's just a really short, quick buzz sound. This little figure here is just showing you, oh, whoops. This is just the spectrogram, so it actually just shows you, it's like a visual of the signal itself. So this was kind of, I thought this was a fun experiment. So in this case, what we did was we trained bees to feeders again, where we marked those bees. We then harassed the bees. So we either allowed those bees to eat and go home naturally, or we pinched them on the leg with forceps. Usually, so forceps are just kind of like a fancy tweezers. So usually when you pinch a bee like that, not all the time, but often when they go home, they'll perform the stop signal. They'll tell other bees, don't go to that food, I got attacked. So what we did was we pinched these bees, and then one of us sat in the dark under red light with an observation hive. So these were bees that were coming out of an observation hive that we built. They would go in, they would go outside, go to the feeder, get pinched, come home. Somebody would watch this bee, follow them around with a microphone, and see whether they perform stop signals. And this was something we did last summer. We performed this experiment all summer. So we followed the bees in June and July, which is a time period where there's a lot of food available. Robbing is very rare. And then we continued to follow them into August and September. And what we found was pretty interesting. So what this is showing you, where's my, oh, here it is. So when you the first thing we found that's interesting is that the number of bees at that feeder that were visiting the feeder steadily increases over the course of these 4 months, June through September. That is an indication of diminishing floral resources in the environment. Honeybees tend to prefer to not visit these artificial feeders, these sucrose feeders. It can actually be very difficult to train them to find the feeder early in the season. So this was an expected pattern. And other studies have shown this too, that the more bees you have at a feeder, the fewer flowers you have in the environment. So when we looked at stop signals, it was even more interesting though. So we found we had these different treatments, the ones where we didn't pinch those bees at all, and then one treatment where we pinched them once, and then another treatment where we attempted to pinch them 5 times. So that was a high level of attack. And if, as you would predict, let's say in June, the more you attack the bees, the more likely they are to produce these stop signals. But what we found is over the season, the number of bees producing the stop signal steadily declines. So even though they're getting attacked just as much, they're registering that attack differently. They're deciding essentially to ignore it. They're not going to go home and tell their nestmates to avoid that food. And this bottom graph is just showing you very similar results, except in terms of the number of stop signals that the bees performed, that also declined. So for the same level of predator threat, these foragers become more and more sort of risk tolerant. They're not telling their hive to avoid this dangerous food. One other measure of that I thought was kind of cool is if you look at that group where we had the high level of aggression, where we tried to pinch them 5 times, most of the time bees won't put up with that. A forager, if you pinch them once, they'll go home. So that's what you see in this little figure here for June. The number of pinches, 1 through 5 down here, this figure is just showing you that most of the bees really tolerated 1 or maybe 2 pinches. Very few stuck around for 5. But over this course of the season, that trend reverses. So by September, these foragers are extremely persistent at the feeder. They're really tolerant of being pinched over time. So they're conflict tolerant and they're less likely to communicate that information to nestmates. So I thought this was really interesting because it tells you that honeybees are changing how they perceive and respond to risk over the season. And you might imagine if you're in an environment where there are very few resources, that the colonies would similarly adjust how they respond to that resource scarcity. There are a lot of studies in honeybees trying to understand how reward, like the value of food, something like the concentration of nectar or the composition of the pollen, how that reward impacts foraging behavior. But very few studies have addressed this risk component. And if you're deciding where and how to collect food, you have to weigh both the risk and the reward. So this is kind of further evidence that these foragers that are robbers are not only more aggressive, but they're kind of risk-taking individuals. They show a lot of differences compared to foragers earlier in the year. So one other area that we've been working on that's related to aggression foraging behavior is competition between wild bees and honeybees for floral resources. So this is an area that's generated a lot of interest and, frankly, controversy. It's controversial in the research community as well as the beekeeping community. But the idea here is that honeybees are competing and perhaps depleting food resources that would otherwise be used by wild bees, and that is contributing to loss of wild bee populations. That has implications for conservation, but also bee ecology and pollination, since these wild bees are also important agricultural and wild pollinators. So we brought a new perspective to this question based on what we know about honeybee foraging behavior, which is that honeybees are more aggressive later in the season. They're more aggressive towards one another. So it would stand to reason that they might also be more aggressive towards wild bees, more competitive for floral resources later in the season. So we wanted to test this question, and this was actually an undergraduate student's project. There are a lot of ways to address this particular question about competition for food. We chose a pretty straightforward behavioral approach because we're behaviorists. So what we did here was we wanted to come up with a floral species that showed abundance. It bloomed throughout the season. We wanted to cover the time frame where we know that honeybees are less aggressive in terms of foraging, as well as the later time frame where we know they become more aggressive. The reason we wanted to choose a single flower to look at is that there are a lot of ways that floral preferences can impact who visits the plant, how persistent different species are on that flower. So we didn't want to introduce multiple species where it would be unclear, is it just they like the plant better, or is there a competitive interaction going on? So we picked white clover for this study. As many of you know, this is a honeybee favorite in terms of a nectar source. It also supports a variety of wild bee species. But this is good because we knew that it would be attractive to honeybees, and we wanted to attract honeybees so we could watch to see whether they're competitive. I didn't know this before I did this study, but this white clover also has an early and late summer bloom. There's a peak of bloom in June and then also one in August. So it gave us this chance to study and compare those two different times of the season. So we designed a pretty basic experiment. This was actually based on a study that had been done a few years ago on lavender, looking at bumblebee and honeybee competition. What we did was we found different small patches of white clover. We took these little tents like you put over food at a picnic. In the afternoon, we would go around and find patches with nice blooming clover. We'd put the tent over it, and then we'd come back the next day to run our experiment. The reason we put the tent over the clover is to prevent any bees from depleting the nectar. So the plants can replenish the nectar overnight, and so the next day we know that these are nice nectar-filled flowers. So we did this experiment on one of our research farms at UK. We had 60 different pairs of those little clover patches. The pairs consisted of one patch that we were going to try to exclude honeybees from, and another where we allowed honeybees to visit. The way we did that is while we were monitoring the bees visiting these patches, if a honeybee arrived at the patch, we would shoo it away if it was a patch that was part of this honeybee exclusion treatment. If it wasn't, we would just allow the honeybee to visit. So that's actually based on that previous study I was telling you, a very simple design, but it's effective. So we compared these different excluded or unexcluded patches across this big farm. Just to give you an idea, this is a 4.5 square mile farm. We had about 35 large hives on this farm last year. So we produced over 1,000 pounds of honey. And if you do some math on that, that's about 2 billion flowers. So I'm telling you that to give you a sense of the honeybee foraging pressure that we know exists in this environment. It's not trivial, put it that way. So we also collected data on blooming flowers. We expected there to be fewer flowers around in August, but we wanted to test that. And so we sampled the flower resources all over the farm as well. So we found some things that were interesting and some things that were surprising. So one thing we found that was interesting, there were no direct fights between honeybees and other bees in this experiment. We did find some wild bees fighting with one another, but that sort of physical aggression to deter bees from the flowers was not something we observed. We didn't monitor these patches for very long because we had to go through a lot of them. But if we counted up the bee visits over a 15-minute time period, we found both wild bees, so this is what we call other bees here, as well as honeybees on these patches. But we see no difference depending on whether or not honeybees were excluded. So when honeybees were excluded, when they visited, we counted them, but we didn't let them feed. We didn't see any more wild bees visiting as a result of that treatment. One thing that was really surprising in the fall measure in August, we actually saw very few honeybees at all on the white clover. This shocked me actually because there isn't very much blooming at this time of year, and I thought there would be a lot of honeybees, but there weren't. We do see quite a few non-honeybee species, but again, no difference depending on whether honeybees were permitted or excluded. This increase in the other bees that are present in the later season could indicate a lot of things. For example, many of these are bumblebees. Those are colonies that are getting larger over the season. That could be why there are more later in the season. So generally speaking, I think this study shows that there was pretty limited competition, at least for white clover in this context between honeybees and wild bees. We don't really know where the other bees are foraging, where honeybees are foraging, especially in August. This little pie chart shows you the variety of different plant species that were blooming at this time on the farm. And this big green chunk is ribwort plantain, this flower or this plant that's pictured here. You guys have probably seen this. So bees do collect pollen from this thing, but it doesn't have any nectar. And so at this time of year, we wouldn't expect it to be a really significant food source for honeybees who are trying to hoard nectar. And that might provoke robbing in some cases. Okay, so I'll wrap it up there. It's just if we have any time for questions, but what I showed you is that forager honeybees can actually be aggressive, and that aggression matters to the colony. It helps acquire enough food to survive the winter. Aggressive foragers are more risk tolerant, so their behaviors change in a variety of ways. They are more tolerant to being attacked. They're less likely to communicate danger to their nestmates. It's a pretty sophisticated change. We see seasonal changes in floral resources, and then the onset of winter promote robbing behaviors. This is literally an increase in aggression amongst the foragers, and they also become more risk tolerant. And for what we've seen so far, the impact of honeybee aggression, that seasonal change, seems limited to other honeybees in terms of the effects on the bee community. We are working on another related study in this area if you're more curious about that kind of wild bee honeybee resource competition. All right, well, thank you for your attention. I just wanted to thank a few people that were involved in this work. And yeah, I'm happy to take questions if we have time.
Thank you so much. We appreciate it. Do you guys have any questions? It looks like most of their heads are shaking no, so we appreciate you speaking with us this evening.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, feel free to follow up if you guys have any other curiosities about any of this work.
Great. Thank you so much.
All right, take it easy.
All righty, have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.